thank you for having me. I wanted to give a warm thank you to the Center for Religion and Public Life at the University of Leeds. In many ways, it feels like a great place to share my work and my thoughts on 3HO. So many of the people at Leeds, our interests kind of overlap. So thinking of Caroline Starkey and her work on women in Buddhism, this is very much a story in no small part about women and Sikhism, or a form of Sikhism in the United States, and Joanna Stevert's work with the Shiloh Project on abuse and gender violence in religion. This is very much a matter of that, and also my dear friend and colleague Jasjit Singh and his work on SIKHs in the diaspora. This is not only a story about Sikhi in the diaspora, but it also has many ties to the UK directly. So this morning for me, this afternoon for you, I'm going to talk about the past history and present management of abuse within Yogi Bhajan's Healthy, Happy, Holy organization. So this is a matter that is very much ongoing in the present. Every month, every week, and in some cases every day, new developments occur and the story changes. So I'm going to begin with an overview of Yogi Bhajan and 3HO so that we can all be on the same page. And then I'm going to talk about abuse and structures of abuse within 3HO. And I'm going to present what I think is an unusual, but perhaps an appropriate and a helpful model for understanding those structures of abuse within 3HO. And that model is money laundering. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the history of attempts to expose abuse within 3HO and the abuse conducted by Yogi Bhajan, and then the recent events that have really, excuse me, exposed that abuse in a way that hasn't been done before. And then talk about the reasons for the limited exposure of abuse within 3HO over all this time, and then to talk about the current management of revealed abuse within 3HO and an idea that I've termed harm calculus, which we can see unfolding over the last half year as events have unfolded. So to begin with, 3HO is an unusual group. I think they are very much a platypus, a singular entity that resists simple categorization with many features and elements that don't seem to go together. So the history of 3HO and of Yogi Bhajan really needs, I think, to be unpacked in order to make sense of it. Yogi Bhajan, pictured here, was born Harbhajan Singh Puri in what is now Pakistan. His family moves to New Delhi in the wake of partition. Puri works as a customs agent at Pullum Airport in Delhi. In 1968, he moves to the West. He first goes to Canada, and then he comes to Los Angeles right at the end of 1968. While he's in Los Angeles, he starts teaching what he calls Kundalini yoga, a form of yoga that he describes as ancient, up until then, secret and not taught in public, powerful, and somehow connected to the Sikh tradition. What we know now is that Puri, who is then known as Yogi Bhajan to his students, was essentially like a bricoleur, combining different elements from various teachers and sants that he had studied with, primarily Swami Dhirendra Brahmachari, Swami Dave Murti, from whom he took physical yogic practices, and from a Sikh sant named Baba Virsa Singh, who Yogi Bhajan kind of adopted Virsa Singh's persona and took a few of his practices and mantras. So as Yogi Bhajan, as a newly and self-minted master of Kundalini yoga, Yogi Bhajan quickly gathers students. And what he does during the first few years with his hippie followers, he quickly dispatches them throughout the country. And these students, often with very little training, some as little as 2 weeks of yoga classes with him, they set up ashrams and yoga centers or teach yoga classes throughout the country, university towns, major cities. And so this kind of creates a feedback loop where word about Yogi Bhajan and Kundalini Yoga spreads throughout the country. People find Yogi Bhajan, and then they in turn are sent out. So you have a quickly growing organization in its first years. As the scholar Van Dussenberry, who's written extensively about 3HO and their relation to Punjabi Sikhs, as Dussenberry has described, by the early mid-70s, Yogi Bhajan's Healthy, Happy, Holy organization takes on Sikhism and integrates it into its framework. So by the mid-70s, you have a series of ashrams and centers throughout the country, and starting in Europe and in other parts of the world, including the UK. And you have this unusual combination of yogic practice, claimed Sikh identity and Sikh practice, and also a growing number of businesses created by the students. So Yogi Bhajan is, during the early 70s, he's mostly centered in Los Angeles, but then a second headquarters gets established in New Mexico, where Yogi Bhajan, as his traveling slows down, he spends more and more time. This is a picture, a more recent picture of several 3HO Sikhs in Espanola, New Mexico, in the headquarters. So very briefly, the businesses that are created, some of them flounder, but some of them grow. And 3HO continues to exist through the 70s and 80s. By the time of the 90s, some of the businesses get really large, some of them probably recognizable by members of our audience in the UK. And it becomes like a platypus. It's under the 3HO umbrella, you have a style of yoga, yoga teachers, yoga teaching certification and training programs. You have nonprofits that represent this version of SIKH practiced by Yogi Bhajan students. We can get into that question of orthodoxy and heterodoxy during the question section. And some of their companies are large and recognizable: Yogi Tea, P Cereal, and Akal Security, which is one of the largest private security contractors in the United States that has a global reach. So when Yogi Bhajan dies in 2004, this is the way that the New York Times starts his obituary. He is the boss of World, Spiritual, and Capitalistic. He has titles of religious authority, endless meetings and photos with various other religious leaders. Yogi Bhajan had courted politicians, and he counted several governors and senators as confidants and friends. The businesses, some of them are huge. So he dies really at the head of this weird amalgamation of all of these different things. Beneath this official history of Yogi Bhajan and 3HO, there is another history, a history of abuse and corruption and misconduct. What we know now, after kind of a slow trickle of information that kind of turned into a flood, we know that Yogi Bhajan was committing sexual misconduct, and that takes a spectrum depending on the survivors that we talk to, a whole range from inappropriate yet possibly consensual sexual relationships, all the way through sexual harassment, sexual battery, and sexual assault. We also know that over years, Yogi Bhajan was grooming young women who he would later abuse. And this seems to be something that was happening from the very beginning. I mentioned that Yogi Bhajan first arrives in Canada and then shows up in Los Angeles. The reason that he moves from Canada to Los Angeles is he gets a woman pregnant, and he is essentially fleeing his responsibilities after impregnating this woman. We also know that there is a vast and deep history of fraud and crime that's conducted within 3HO. Members of 3HO, closely placed alongside Yogi Bhajan, are involved in telemarketing schemes, drug smuggling, fraudulent gem sales, kind of, I don't know how to describe this, more kind of personal low-level defrauding, getting people to sign over homes or donate inheritances. There was a place in Los Angeles that was represented as being an official business, but we now know that it was a boiler room. It conducted what was known as toner scams, where people would work the phones, students of Yogi Bhajan would work the phones, call up nonprofits and schools and get them to place orders for office supplies that would never be sent, and in many cases never existed in the first place. And we also know from ex-members that Yogi Bhajan was not only directly aware, but he was directly encouraging the telemarketing fraud at this business, infamously telling his students, there is no karma over the telephone, so nothing to worry about. Perhaps in terms of scale and scope, and I think very much so in terms of severity, were abuse and misconduct that were inflicted upon the second generation members of 3HO, people who were born into 3HO as children from the early members of 3HO. So beginning in the 1980s, 3HO children were sent to boarding schools in India, where they were subjected to a whole host of abuses, everything from malnourishment to physical beatings and other forms of abuse. And the numbers of children, many now adults, who went through this abuse is just massive. So how do we understand what 3HO was? So we have this kind of platypus-like amalgamation of different things: New Age spirituality, claimed traditional SIKH businesses, communal living that was also done within a very hierarchical top-down structure. When we combine that with 3HO's own dizzying organizational structure, I love the image at the top as the abridged organizational chart, kind of preparing you for the whirlwind you encounter when you see the unabridged organizational charts. And also, how do we think about the complexity within 3HO, its own complex organizational structures, and its history of abuse? When we take abuse and crime and misconduct into account when we think about 3HO, we're really faced with this dizzying prospect that the reality of 3HO is almost the opposite of what it portrays. I think two of the best examples of this come from 3HO periodicals in the late 1970s. Members of 3HO who had converted to their form of SIKH, they claimed to be more orthodox than 99.9% of other Sikhs in the world. In their periodicals, especially Sikh Dharma Brotherhood, 3HO Sikhs felt little hesitation to refer to other Sikhs as traitors, as dogs, as putits. And one of their particular objects of attack were Punjabi Sikhs, especially in the diaspora, who had cut their hair in violation of Sikh tenets. And what we now know through the revelations of many ex-members is that the women on Yogi Bhajan's staff, the ones that he had inappropriate sexual relations with, he would instruct them to shave their body hair. So while at the same time 3HO is attacking other Sikhs for trimming their hair, Yogi Bhajan is commanding his close female followers to do exactly that. This was another quote that I found amazing once again in Sikh Dharma Brotherhood from 1977, attacks on Punjabi Sikhs that would dare to criticize Yogi Bhajan. And the author, in trying to laud Yogi Bhajan and what great work he had been doing, tries to paint a picture of a fallen West that Yogi Bhajan arrives to. And I'm going to read this in one moment. Quote, in this part of the world where political, social, and economic corruption, sexual orgies, promiscuity, dehumanization, widespread and legalized drug addiction reign, where the family is dead as a reality, where patriotism has become a joke, where money and sex are the two triumphant gods, one humble man from the house of Guru Ram Das came to teach the divine ways of the Guru, and by the Guru's grace to establish the order of the Khalsa. Besides the really optimistic portrayal of what Yogi Bhajan was doing, if you take a close look at this description of the fallen West, in light of what has been revealed about 3HO, you can see that every single charge that's lobbied against the corrupt West was very much true of 3HO and Yogi Bhajan. Economic corruption, sexual orgies, that took place often at the direct instruction of Yogi Bhajan, promiscuity, dehumanization. There are many accounts of Yogi Bhajan psychologically and verbally and physically abusing people, instructing them to do dehumanizing acts. Widespread and legalized drug addiction. We have Yogi Bhajan's right hand swept up in one of the largest drug smuggling busts in American history. Where the family is dead as a reality, we have a history going back to almost the earliest years of 3HO of detachment parenting, where children are separated from their parents, raised by other families. Then we have the boarding schools where children are literally sent on the other side of the world from their families. So, I mean, this makes the charge that in the West the family is dead as deeply and sadly ironic. And where money and sex are the two triumphant gods in the West, looking at the totality of the abuse and corruption perpetrated by Yogi Bhajan and within 3HO makes you wonder if those were not Yogi Bhajan's, the two gods that Yogi Bhajan himself worshipped. So I would argue that the best way to make sense of 3HO and the abuse in 3HO is through money laundering. To give a brief explanation of how money laundering works, let's say that you're a drug dealer and you make a lot of money by dealing drugs. You can't report on your taxes that you're a drug dealer. That would cause some problems. Also, you can't spend the money that you earn as a drug dealer without incurring the risk of being charged with tax evasion. You can't spend lavishly and only report a fraction of that on your taxes. So what does a criminal do? If you were a hypothetical drug dealer, you would need a way of making your illicit earnings legitimate. So the process of money laundering is doing just that. And in its simplest forms, money laundering has three main components: placement, layering, and integration. Placement, illicit money is placed within an entity, usually a business, where it can be laundered. Layering is where licit money and illicit money are combined. And integration, once they are combined, that money can then be extracted. You can spend the money you earned as a drug dealer without fear of it not being reported or it somehow revealing its source. Perhaps the component of money laundering that people are most familiar with is the idea of a front business. So imagine that you're a drug dealer and you can't spend your cash and you have nowhere to put it. You invest in a restaurant. You invest in, I'm sorry, Rocco's Pizzeria. I'm implying nothing illegal going on at Rocco's Pizzeria. It's just a nice image of a pizza place. So if you're a drug dealer, you place your money in an institution like Rocco's Pizzeria. And what happens is, as the pizzeria functions, as it makes money, you inflate its earnings. And so you are able to, as you take money out, you are able to combine your illicit money with the legal earnings of the pizzeria. And at the end of the day, you have a legitimate company that pays taxes and whose earnings you can rightfully claim and spend. I think something comparable is at work in the history of 3HO. We have evidence that Yogi Bhajan's abuse was going on from before his arrival in the United States, perhaps before his arrival in Canada. We also know through interviews that I did with earliest hosts that Yogi Bhajan did not originally intend to teach yoga. Perhaps yoga was one of a few options that he had available to him in the United States. So I think it's helpful to think of Yogi Bhajan's abuse as kind of being placed into a religious, spiritual context. And with the layering, we can think of the legitimate aspects of 3HO, the teaching of yoga, the claims to help people. I think most importantly, the idea of being a religious institution, being part of the Sikh tradition as a way of obscuring and covering up what was really going on. And the integration, I think, would be the way that the entire system of 3HO facilitated Yogi Bhajan's abuse. It allowed him to abuse others, to take advantage of others, and essentially get away with it, and provide a system in which it was justifiable or understood if people knew. That's one of the things that I think is really worth pausing and emphasizing. From what we see now in 3HO, it really was, I joke about it being a platypus with all of these different forms kind of combined into one entity. But it really was an integrated system of abuse. From the things that have come out over the last several decades and over the last year, we can see how the businesses, the money from the businesses, the position and the fraudulent titles that Yogi Bhajan claimed, the boarding schools, all of these worked together to facilitate his abuse, to bring in more money that allowed him to commit more sexual misconduct. All of these things kind of worked together. So there were people as early as the late 60s and early 70s who cast doubt on Yogi Bhajan's legitimacy and raised questions about what he was doing. Perhaps the first real substantial and public claims of abuse within 3HO are occurring in 1977. There's an article in Time magazine titled Yogi Bhajan's Synthetic Sikhism, and there is a book by the Indian author Trilochan Singh titled Sikhism and Tantric Yoga. Trilochan Singh tours the United States. He speaks to many of Yogi Bhajan's current and former students, and at the end of his trip, he pulls together a short yet scathing, detail-rich book where he talks about Yogi Bhajan's abuse and fraud. Throughout the 1980s, there are a series of lawsuits against Yogi Bhajan. Two of his former secretaries, Pamela Dyson and Kate Felt, they file lawsuits against him. There's a man named Mark Baker who claims that 3HO prevented his ability to find work by slandering his character. He sues 3HO, and in the newspaper articles about this, he makes all sorts of claims that we now know to have basis in reality, of sexual misconduct, of drug smuggling. There is another lawsuit in the 1980s from a female former student of Yogi Bhajan who claims that he directed her to have a hysterectomy. She sues him. That case is dismissed because of the statute of limitations. So there are a whole host of lawsuits and newspaper articles and scandals in the 1980s. After Yogi Bhajan's death, other stories come out. And I think very importantly, this is something we can talk about during the question and answer period. In the 1990s, the internet comes around, and you start to have a series of message boards from ex-members of 3HO who discuss among themselves what they experienced and what they saw in 3HO. And this is really a game changer in terms of revealing abuse and putting pieces together, and ex-members being able to connect with each other. Early this year, Yogi Bhajan's former secretary and one of the most high-ranking members of 3HO, Pamela Dyson, self-published her memoir titled Premka, Whitebird in a Golden Cage. In her memoir, she details her time in 3HO and her experiences leaving 3HO, and she gives a very vivid, clear, and engaging account of her betrayal by Yogi Bhajan, her disillusionment with him, and also the sexual nature of their relationship, both him with her and him with other secretaries. And this memoir really served to open up the floodgates in terms of revealing abuse within 3HO. I think there are several reasons for this. Some of them are more general, and some of them are more specific and unique to the book and when it was released. So over the last 5-10 years, we've had the rise of the Me Too movement and numerous revealed scandals involving yoga gurus. And so I think this helped to wear away at the resistance that many people would have in accepting what Pamela wrote about in her memoir. We are not only, I hope, more able to believe women and believe victims of abuse, but the patterns of abusers have been made abundantly clear in public. Jerry Sandusky, a football coach in the United States, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein. We see the pattern of abuse, how systems of abuse function. And also with the seemingly never-ending series of yoga scandals, people like Bikram, John Friend, the release and popular reception of the documentary Wild Wild Country, the revealed abuse of Patabi Joyce, Swami Vishnu Devananda. In the wake of those scandals, I think it's harder and harder to deny that such a thing would be possible. We also have the particular context of Pamela herself. In many ways, her memoir works because of the genre. It is a memoir that limits its scope to her own experience. She doesn't make bigger claims. She sticks to her own experience. She doesn't assume or jump to conclusions about other people. So there are very limited but also very substantial claims that she makes. And she had a unique position within 3HO. She was respected, if not idolized, within 3HO. She had a high-ranking position. She was involved in much of the creation and building of the organization. So not unironically, the fact that Pamela was an ideal member, it allowed her to be a believable former member. It allowed, I think, many people who are still within 3HO to read the memoir and not automatically dismiss it out of hand. There's also the unusual context of the release of her memoir. So it comes out just about a month or two before the pandemic hits. So suddenly people have a lot of time at home to read and to be online. And so on social media, many people, spurred on by the memoir and its discussions, they started to reveal their own stories of abuse at the hands of Yogi Bhajan and within 3HO. Excuse me. So suddenly it becomes a matter of not believing or disbelieving Pamela's account, but believing or disbelieving the accounts of several women. It's hard to keep count, as we're going to discuss in a moment, but well over a dozen initially, and then more and more. So unable to deny or not deal with these accusations, 3HO commissions a third-party report by an entity known as an olive branch. They are a kind of a mediation crisis management group that specializes in scandal and misconduct done within spiritual organizations. And I think it says a lot, too, that you can have an organization that just specializes in that. An olive branch, the investigation was publicly announced, and people contacted an olive branch, and they conducted hundreds of interviews. And they eventually went through all of them, compiled them, and released a report in the summer of this year. And I can provide a link, or you can find it through my website. Myself and the journalist Stacy Stukin, we wrote a news article that details the findings of the report done by an olive branch. It's a little less than 100 pages, but what it does is it establishes that more likely than not, Yogi Bhajan systematically and repeatedly abused numerous women within 3HO. The report can be read by anyone, but it detailed abuse ranging from crude language, sexual harassment, the showing of pornography, all the way through sexual misconduct, grooming, sexual battery, and sexual assault. And I think it raises many questions. I think one of the questions, perhaps one of the first that should be asked, is why did this only come out until 2020, when allegations had been circling around for decades, with Yogi Bhajan having been dead for almost 16 years? Why at this point? What was preventing the revelation of abuse and misconduct within 3HO? I would say that there are several reasons for this. I think some of them are very general, in some sense, not unique to 3HO. The way that 3HO is structured, with ashrams and centers throughout the country and throughout the world, many people had ignorance of the abuse that happened. Some of them, I think, quite fairly said, I barely saw Yogi Bhajan. I lived on the other side of the country. I maybe saw him once a year. It was also the nature of the abuse. It was kept hidden from most people. I think there was a core of people who knew in detail what was going on. I think there were many people who had clear ideas of what was going on, but some people, I think, were legitimately in the dark. I also think there are the kinds of decisions and negotiations that were made among individuals. Many people had doubts, but because their families were in 3HO, because their entire lives and identities were wrapped up in 3HO, they felt perhaps it was best to ignore those doubts and to continue on with business as usual. I think one of the reasons unique to 3HO that helped prevent closer scrutiny, allowed more abuse and misconduct to go on, was 3HO and Yogi Bhajan's unique claims to the SIKH tradition. Doris Jacobs wrote an article about 3HO being the forgotten new religious movement. And you see in the literature on so-called cults in the 70s and 80s and 90s, 3HO often flies under the radar. Within the scholarly work on new religious movements, 3HO is ironically mostly mentioned as a group that isn't studied, that is ignored or is overlooked. And I think the claims to a religious tradition is one of those reasons. 3HO constantly distanced itself from questions of being a cult by saying that we are a religious tradition. And they pointed to the tens of millions of other Sikhs around the world and the centuries and centuries of Sikh history as a way of saying that we are not new, we're not novel, we're not unique, we're part of a larger tradition. 3HO and Yogi Bhajan also never missed an opportunity to push forward aspects of their teachings and lifestyle that would resonate positively with an American audience. Yogi Bhajan always liked to say that we have jobs, we work hard, we believe in marriage and the family, we're against drugs, all of these things that would kind of settle the doubts of most Americans who would look at other groups, say like the Hare Krishnas or the Unification Church, and have suspicion. Yogi Bhajan also would, on one hand, deny his role as a guru. He would claim to just be religious authority. He would claim to be a teacher. And I think that also helped. And as other people have pointed out, there was even just the aesthetic of 3HO, of men and women, while maybe looking unusual on Main Street in the United States, they still had a very religious air about them. And clean flowing all white clothes sort of implied a clean lifestyle and a clean organization. I think also one of the reasons why there was such a limited exposure of abuse comes from Yogi Bhajan himself. In his lectures and in his teachings, there are so many ideas and sayings that would cast doubt on people who left the organization or people that would doubt him. There are endless claims that he makes about his own wisdom and his own authority. And we see that in the report done by an not unlike many of the weirder aspects of the recent US presidential election. In the final months of information gathering from an olive branch, they were flooded by supporters of Yogi Bhajan. And I think this is one of the really interesting aspects of their report. You get to see quotes from the most dedicated true believers in Yogi Bhajan, the deniers of abuse. And they are often repeating ideas that Yogi Bhajan himself told his students about himself. That he couldn't really be understood, he couldn't be judged, he was working on a higher level, he was a spiritual master, he was like Jesus. So excuses for Yogi Bhajan's behavior are coming from Yogi Bhajan himself. Also, he is constantly talking about people who leave and the threats to himself. So people who leave, they're lost in their ego, they've missed a great opportunity, that because he is a holy man, he is a saint, saints are always slandered, saints are always attacked. And Yogi Bhajan is constantly fueling the ideas that he is under threat, he could die soon, and that he is physically suffering because of the faults of his students. And I think this is a very effective way of enhancing the attachment that his students have to him, and also making it much more difficult to question him or speak out against him within the group. And so you really have this dynamic that I think the excusing of abuse or even the inability to look for or recognize abuse really strengthens over time. When you look at many of the people who do leave 3HO, there are constantly people at a slow trickle who are leaving throughout the 70s. You have major exoduses of members in the 80s and in the 90s. You think about that dynamic. What kind of people would leave the group? It's often people with a strong moral sense who refuse to stay if they know certain things are going on. People with the ability and resources to leave. People who are capable to get a job somewhere else. People who have support from their family or other friends outside the group. And who does that leave? Who remains? I think you could make an argument that the people who stay are the people who don't have that moral sense. People who are willing to excuse misconduct and behavior. People who are less capable of doubting Yogi Bhajan. People who don't have the ability or resources to leave. So with all that said, reasons for overlooking and ignoring abuse over the decades, the abuse, our understanding of the abuse that came out What has happened over the last year, over the last 6 months? What has happened since Pamela's memoir and since the report released by An Olive Branch? In some cases, in many cases, there has been a complete rejection of the figure of Yogi Bhajan and his teaching. Many studios took down Yogi Bhajan's pictures. Many people eliminated the name of Yogi Bhajan from their teaching. Some people stopped the practice of Kundalini yoga outright. On social media, there were many people who burned their yoga manuals, burned pictures of Yogi Bhajan. It was unsupportable. In light of the abuse, many people just completely rejected Yogi Bhajan and Kundalini yoga itself. For many other people, there were more complicated responses to the abuse. I would pithily describe the two main impulses behind these complicated responses as who cares and it works. Many members, when faced with the abuse of Yogi Bhajan, basically said these two things. Well, who cares about the abuse? And the abuse doesn't matter because it, meaning the Kundalini yoga or their lifestyle and practices, it works. And this could take many forms. For some people, their response was that these revelations of abuse are false. And some of these were unique to 3HO, but some of them were just kind of common accusations that are leveled against survivors of abuse. The claims are made up, they're lies, these people are crazy, these women are getting paid, it's part of a giant conspiracy. Another major strand said that the revelations of abuse do not matter. Some of them said that what would be the real shame is to dwell on negativity or focus on the bad. Other people said that the revelations of abuse are true and they do matter, but they do not warrant any significant or structural change. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So this is an example of one prominent student of Yogi Bhajan and Kundalini yoga teacher who decided to cobble together an hour-long video compilation to basically insinuate that Pamela and then all other women were just liars who had betrayed their wonderful teacher. Another prominent Kundalini yoga teacher, Gurmukh Karkhalsa, in a series of very Pollyanna-ish statements and interviews, told her students, without ever really addressing the allegations of abuse, said that she, quote, chooses to live in joy. And by focusing on the joy, that's what's really important. This is a video actually from several years ago from a person on YouTube who came across the allegations of abuse a few years prior to the memoir and the report by An Olive Branch. And his charming and sensitive conclusion is, who cares? The yoga works, I like the yoga, and it doesn't matter what he did, what he as Yogi Bhajan did. The yoga still works, so I don't care if he was abusive. It doesn't matter to me. Other public teachers have made kind of more complicated statements where they to strike a balance and still move forward. This is Guru Singh from Los Angeles, who previously claimed his closeness and proximity to Yogi Bhajan, and then he started widening his lineage to say that he studied with people beyond just Yogi Bhajan, and that he might have had faults, but the yoga worked. But all these kind of ongoing negotiations of a relationship with Yogi Bhajan, the nature of the yoga that Yogi Bhajan taught, which really points to, I think, perhaps the most practical aspect of all of these things going on, which is that not only are many people suddenly on a new ground in terms of their identity and their relationship to their own past, but many of them are financially dependent on teaching yoga and the image of Yogi Bhajan as it previously existed. I've coined a term to describe a lot of these negotiations that have been going on. I call it harm calculus, and I define it as a process by which members and ex-members of a spiritual community reappraise the group, its leadership, its practices, their experiences, and or their involvement in the light of revealed abuse and misconduct. So harm calculus is one great example is the decisions that people make to still teach or practice yoga after knowing that the creator of that yoga was a serial abuser. The most common calculations are that he was bad, Yogi Bhajan was bad, he did bad things, but the yoga is still good. Some people have even argued for a very kind of like Catholic, papal, ex-cathedra kind of understanding where Yogi Bhajan was just a man when he wasn't teaching, but he was more than a man when he was teaching. Other teachers have claimed that Yogi Bhajan was channeling his wisdom. So he was just a vessel. And so we don't have to worry about this wisdom that is beyond him merely passing through him. It's an ongoing process, and we're seeing all kinds of calculations being done by current and former members as the totality of the abuse slowly starts to come to light and they start making their own decisions. We've seen this not only on the individual level, but we've seen this with 3HO on an organizational level. In real time, it's been fascinating to see the kinds of steps that they have taken to rebrand their yoga, not only in a time of revealed abuse, but also in the time of pandemic when a lot of the usual forms and structure of their organization have come to a stop. You can no longer have in-person yoga classes, in-person teacher training programs, or in-person gatherings. So the Kundalini Research Institute, they have, in the wake of the abuse, they have in some ways toned down the role of Yogi Bhajan. There are moves underway to redescribe their form of yoga from Kundalini yoga as taught by Yogi Bhajan to Kundalini yoga as originally taught or originally practiced by Yogi Bhajan. Instead of being a central and pivotal and essential figure, he's now getting moved into the background. And I find it ironic on a personal level because in 2012, I wrote an article. This isn't the cover for it. In 2012, I wrote an article for SIKH Formations about the origins of Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga. And so this was almost 8 years earlier. And I received no response, and there was no official statements by 3HO. In my article, I said that unlike Yogi Bhajan's claims to be teaching a secret form of yoga that he was the inheritor from, he was essentially combining different physical practices from various teachers, along with the persona and some mantras from Baba Veer Singh. There was no response from 3HO, and in fact, they, as I later heard, they threatened to punish yoga centers and yoga teachers that shared the article. Ironically, many of the things that I claimed that were so damning at the time, that Yogi Bhajan was just combining things from different teachers, that maybe the personal experience of practitioners was important as well, along with the claimed history. Those kind of became the playbook, seemingly for KRI, as they started to bring forward in the wake of the Olive Branch report, Yogi Bhajan's other teachers and the syncretic nature of yoga itself, and highlighting things like personal experience as an effective way to minimize, I would say, the toxic presence of Yogi Bhajan in their style of yoga. KRI also committed to going deeper into scientific and medical research on yoga. I think this is a more sophisticated and institutional level of the simple method of it works. It doesn't matter who created the yoga, what its troubled history is. If it can be scientifically tested and validated, then it works, and then we can move forward. And perhaps I think the most kind of amazing development over the last few months is what I would describe as woke washing. In the light of abuse and in light of 3HO and SIKH DHARMA's very difficult and problematic history with the larger Sikh Panth and Punjabi Sikhs specifically, KRI has undergone an emphasis on social justice and inclusion, and featuring yogis and yoginis of color on their social media pages and on their own website, as a way to, I would argue, take away from the revelations of abuse. It's almost like a non sequitur. Instead of directly addressing the history of abuse or asking the troubling questions of how that abuse and the abusive figure of Yogi Bhajan were inextricably linked to their organizations and to their practices, it's emphasizing social justice instead. So as we're approaching the hour and I want to leave time for questions and discussions, I think there are several things that the history of abuse and the ongoing management of abuse within 3HO bring up. I think perhaps the biggest is starting to see abuse as an integrated part of a spiritual organization. A lot of the harm calculus that's being done relies on partitioning off abuse, seeing abuse as being done at certain times or with certain people or in certain contexts. I think what is clear in the example of 3HO and Kundalini Yoga is that it was much more systemic and it was much more integrated within the practice of yoga itself. And we can talk about that, but many of Yogi Bhajan's supposed teachings, when viewed in light of the history of abuse and misconduct, it's clear that he is making those statements to lay the groundwork and to facilitate further abuse. I think another interesting topic of discussion would be what I term the firewall of language in the wake of revelations of abuse. What we are seeing in 3HO, and as we've seen in other spiritual organizations that have been rocked by revelations of abuse, is that the organization starts moving into other parts of the world. One of the big reasons for this is the firewall of language. Discussions on social media, reporting that's done in the group often doesn't get translated into other languages. So we see Bikram going into Mexico. We see 3HO and other groups starting to get more and more of a presence in the wake of revealed abuse in other parts of the world, where perhaps people are less familiar with this history of abuse. And I think another interesting matter is the different styles and the different climates in different cultures. One of the things that we saw in the wake of revelations of abuse within 3HO is that there were often very different reactions from different parts of the world. Some cultures that had more Catholic backgrounds, that had more patriarchal backgrounds, were much more vocal in denying the accounts of survivors. I think another interesting topic of discussion is comparing and contrasting spiritual and secular systems of abuse. I mentioned Jerry Sandusky and Harvey Weinstein. It's interesting to put those side by side with Yogi Bhajan. How are they the same? What can we learn about abuse in a spiritual and religious context from abuse within secular systems? How are they similar? What can they show us? And also, what remains? What is unique about abuse within spiritual systems? One of the things that I personally found revealing and surprising in the report prepared by an olive branch was how much Yogi Bhajan's claimed titles and positions of spiritual authority facilitated his abuse. We see that again and again. His claims to be a unique master of Tantra, to be a master of Kundalini yoga, even to be the claimed head of SIKHs for the Western Hemisphere, all of those were seen as reasons why he needed to be listened to, he needed to be obeyed, he couldn't be questioned, and why his abuse was allowed to occur in many cases. And finally, I think what is going on in 3HO over the last 6 months, over the last year, I think is a very valuable example of seeing what is valued within metaphysical spirituality and what is valued within modern yoga. It's easy to theorize what is valued. Medical science, personal experience, consumerism. It's another thing to see these things very kind of obviously be rolled out in response to an abuse, revelations of abuse, and to be deliberately positioned to counterbalance or obscure questions and legacies of abuse.